The billionaire CEO had 37 lawyers on payroll, but not one stood beside her when the judge called her name. Charlotte Whitmore had built hospitals, funded children's research, and signed paychecks for people who now stared through her like glass. Her own attorney lowered his eyes and walked away. The CFO who betrayed her smiled from the opposite table. A federal courtroom can feel colder than a winter street when every friend becomes a witness. And in the back row, holding a mop instead of a briefcase, Daniel Mercer heard the lie before anyone else recognized its sound. The old courthouse in downtown Boston was glowing under pale morning light, its marble walls polished enough to reflect every nervous face inside room 12C. Reporters lined the benches with notebooks ready, their whispers moving like dry leaves across the floor. At the defense table, Charlotte stood alone in a navy suit that looked too perfect for the fear hiding beneath it. Her hands were still, but her breathing was not. Judge Rebecca Harlan looked down over her glasses and said, "Ms. Whitmore, where is your counsel?" Charlotte turned toward Martin Vale, the man who had advised her for 7 years, the man who had promised her the night before that everything was under control. Martin rose slowly, adjusted his tie, and spoke with the careful tone of someone saving himself. "Your Honor, due to a newly discovered conflict of interest, I must withdraw from representation immediately." A low murmur rolled through the room. Charlotte blinked once, then again, as if the words had landed somewhere too deep for pain to reach right away. Across the aisle, Grant Ellison, her chief financial officer, sat between 3 attorneys in dark suits, his silver pen resting neatly beside a stack of exhibits. He did not look surprised. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. Not the expensive watch, not the polished shoes, not the way Grant's lawyers leaned in like men already counting victory. Daniel noticed the absence of surprise, because honest men react when a life collapses in public. Guilty men rehearse the fall. Daniel Mercer pushed his mop bucket 2 inches back from the doorway and lowered his gaze before anyone could catch him watching. To the room, he was just the janitor, a quiet white single dad in a gray uniform, 42 years old, with tired eyes and a lunch bag folded in his back pocket. His name badge had a scratch across the last 3 letters. His work shoes squeaked softly on the tile. At 7:15 that morning, he had packed a peanut butter sandwich for his daughter Emily, kissed the top of her head, and promised he would make her school recital by 6. Now he stood inside a federal courtroom where a woman with a billion-dollar company was being left without a voice. Judge Harlan's gavel tapped once, not hard, just enough to restore order. "Ms. Whitmore, this is a serious matter. The government's emergency motion seeks asset restrictions, executive suspension, and preservation of corporate records." Charlotte swallowed. "Your Honor, I did not authorize any illegal transfer. I did not falsify trial data. I did not steal from my own company." Grant's attorney stood with smooth confidence. "The records will show otherwise." Daniel's fingers tightened around the mop handle. 3 sentences, 3 accusations. Too clean, too practiced. Charlotte looked to the gallery, but every familiar face turned away. In that moment, wealth did not protect her. Status did not shelter her. Reputation did not hold her hand. Only truth remained, quiet as breath, waiting for one person with enough dignity to stand. Daniel had learned that invisible people hear the truth first, not because they are smarter than everyone else, but because no one bothers to perform for them. He moved along the back wall with slow, careful steps, guiding the mop around chair legs, briefcases, and the polished heels of people who never looked down unless they had dropped something valuable. A young reporter whispered that Charlotte Whitmore was finished. An older board member muttered that the company needed distance from scandal. One of Grant Ellison's attorneys gave a soft laugh and said, "She should have settled when she had the chance." Daniel kept his face still. Stillness had protected him for years. Stillness had paid rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in Quincy, bought secondhand winter coats, and helped Emily believe her father was never worried even when the refrigerator was nearly empty. At 8 years old, Emily had once asked him why some people spoke to him like furniture. Daniel had told her, "Because furniture holds up a room without needing applause." She had smiled at that, the kind of smile that made every hard day feel useful. Now his phone buzzed silently in his pocket. The school's number flashed on the screen. He could not answer inside the courtroom, but the sight of it pulled at him like a small hand. Emily had been nervous about her recital all week. She had practiced America the Beautiful on a borrowed keyboard, stopping every few lines to ask whether her mother would have liked it. Daniel always said yes. He always said it gently. He always carried the ache afterward where no one could see. At the front of the room, Judge Harlan studied the motion before her. Charlotte stood with her shoulders square, remarkably composed for a woman watching her life being divided into exhibits. She was striking in a way that came less from money and more from discipline, with clear blue eyes, fair skin, and light brown hair pinned neatly behind one ear. But Daniel could see the tremor in her right thumb as she pressed it against her palm. Pride was holding her upright. Fear was standing beside her. "Your Honor," Grant's lead attorney said, rising again. "The company cannot risk further interference from Miss Whitmore. We request immediate temporary removal from executive authority pending investigation." Charlotte turned sharply. "That would hand my company to the same people who manufactured this." A few people scoffed. Judge Harlan lifted one hand. "Miss Whitmore, without counsel, I strongly advise caution." Daniel's mop paused near the evidence cart. A clerk had placed several folders there, one slipping slightly over the edge. The top page showed a wire authorization form, clean, stamped, and presented as fact. Daniel saw the date first, then the formatting, then the signature line. Something in his chest went cold, not with fear, but recognition. 10 years away from the law had not taken the law out of him. He had seen documents like that before, dressed in certainty, smelling of ink and arrogance, built to make innocence look expensive and guilt look official. The folder slid another inch. Daniel caught it before it hit the floor. The paper felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because Daniel understood what a document could do when people trusted the stamp more than the soul beneath it. He placed the folder back on the evidence cart with the care of a man returning a sleeping child to bed, yet his eyes had already taken what they needed. The wire authorization listed Charlotte Whitmore's approval at 2:13 in the morning on a Thursday, but the font spacing was wrong. The company seal was half a shade too dark, and her signature carried a hesitation no real signature carries when written by the same hand for years. At the front, Grant Ellison's attorney stepped closer to the bench, confident and polished, speaking in a voice made for cameras. "Your Honor, Exhibit 4 demonstrates that Miss Whitmore personally approved the transfer of $48 million from a restricted research account into a private holding structure." Charlotte's face went pale, but her chin stayed lifted. "That is not true. The form bears your signature. Then the form is false. The bank records match. Then someone made them match." A ripple of disbelief passed through the room, not loud enough to be called laughter, but sharp enough to cut. Daniel saw Charlotte hear it. She did not fold, but something inside her absorbed the wound. That was how public humiliation worked. It rarely shouted. It gathered small sounds, a cough, a whisper, a chair shifting away, until a person felt the whole world stepping back. Judge Harlan leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore, accusations of fabrication require more than insistence." Charlotte nodded slowly, her blue eyes shining under the sterile lights. "I understand, Your Honor. But I spent that night at St. Abigail's Children's Clinic. We opened the new neonatal wing. There were donors, doctors, nurses, security cameras. I left after midnight and went straight home." Grant adjusted his cuff, serene as snowfall on a locked road. "Convenient memory," he said softly, not to the judge, but loud enough for the reporters to catch. Charlotte turned toward him. "You were there when I approved the clinic funding." "I attend many events," Grant replied. "I cannot be responsible for what you did afterward." 3 board members in the second row lowered their eyes at the same time. Daniel noticed that too. Shame has a rhythm. So does conspiracy. The government attorney requested immediate preservation of Charlotte's personal devices, temporary suspension of her voting rights, and limited access to all executive systems. The words sounded administrative, almost harmless, but Daniel knew they were a quiet stripping away of a person's name, office, work, and future. Charlotte's company had made portable cardiac monitors for rural hospitals across America. Her research teams had sent machines into towns where the nearest specialist was 80 miles away. Yet now she stood inside a federal courtroom being painted as someone who had stolen from the very patients she built her life to serve. Daniel looked again at Grant. No sweat at the temples. No tightened jaw. No worry. Only patience. The patience of a man waiting for a door he had already unlocked. Then Martinvale, still standing near the aisle with his leather briefcase in hand, refused to meet Charlotte's eyes. She whispered his name once. Martin. He said nothing. That silence landed harder than any accusation. Daniel's phone buzzed again in his pocket, and for 1 second, Emily's recital, the borrowed keyboard, and her small nervous smile came back to him. He should have stayed invisible. He had promised himself years ago that courtrooms were no longer his burden. But then Charlotte placed both palms on the defense table, alone, abandoned, still telling the truth in a room paid to doubt her. Daniel looked at the false exhibit, then at the judge, and the old part of him opened its eyes. Daniel did not move at first, because restraint had become the fence around his life. He watched Judge Harlan turn a page, watched Charlotte stand beneath the tall windows where winter sunlight poured across the oak panels like pale gold, watched Grant Ellison rest one hand over the exhibit binder as if he owned not only the evidence, but the air inside the room. Outside, beyond the courthouse glass, Boston traffic slid along the street in soft morning flashes, black town cars, yellow cabs, delivery trucks, ordinary lives passing a building where one woman's future was being quietly taken apart. Charlotte looked beautiful in the saddest way a person can look beautiful, not polished for admiration, but dignified under pressure, her fair face steady, her light brown hair catching the cold shine from the courtroom lamps, her blue eyes refusing to fall even when every friendly chair around her had turned empty. Daniel lowered his mop into the bucket, and the small sound of water seemed louder to him than the lawyer's. Your Honor, Grant's attorney said, the board has already voted to cooperate with federal oversight. Charlotte turned. Without notifying me. Emergency circumstances allowed it. You created the emergency. The records created it. The judge's pen stopped. The gallery quieted for half a breath. Then the whispers returned, thinner and meaner. Daniel looked at the exhibit card again. There was another folder beneath the wire authorization, marked internal access logs. A corner of the sheet showed a sequence of numbers, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for a man who once spent 16-hour days unraveling fraud cases from paper trails no one else wanted to read. He saw a server location code, then a login credential ending in 942, then a timestamp repeated across 3 separate systems within 4 seconds. Too perfect. Real human action makes small delays. Fabricated records march like soldiers in a parade. Daniel felt the past rise in him with the scent of old coffee, courthouse dust, and sleepless nights over trial binders. He remembered standing behind a different table 10 years earlier, wearing a navy suit instead of gray coveralls, asking one question that broke open a case worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He remembered applause he never trusted, headlines he never asked for, and the phone call from the hospital that made every victory feel hollow. After his wife passed, Emily had been 5, small enough to fit against his chest, frightened enough to stop sleeping unless his hand rested on her door. The law could wait. His daughter could not. So Daniel stepped out of the light, took work where no one expected anything from him, and learned the holy discipline of being present. But present did not mean blind. Quiet did not mean powerless. Judge Harlan lifted the emergency order. Unless Miss Whitmore can provide immediate contrary evidence, the court is inclined to grant temporary relief. Charlotte inhaled, and for the first time, Daniel saw the smallest fracture in her composure. Martinvale shifted toward the exit. Grant's mouth curved with a victory he tried to hide. Daniel looked at the school call still glowing on his phone, then at the woman standing alone before a machine built to crush her politely. He wiped his hand on a clean towel, stepped away from the bucket, and walked toward the aisle with nothing but grace, memory, and a truth too sharp to stay buried. The first person to notice Daniel was a court security officer near the side door, a broad man with tired eyes who had seen enough strange mornings to know when silence was about to change shape. He straightened slightly as Daniel came forward, not rushing, not challenging, simply walking with the calm of a father crossing a school auditorium to fix a microphone before his child's song. The mop bucket remained behind him, its wheels turned toward the back wall, a humble little monument to the life everyone thought they understood. Charlotte saw him from the corner of her eye and turned just enough to recognize the man who had caught the folder. Grant saw him too, and for the first time that morning, annoyance crossed his face. "Excuse me," one of Grant's attorneys said, standing halfway. Court staff should remain outside the well. Daniel stopped at the wooden rail. Your Honor, he said, his voice low, clear, and steady. That exhibit is false. The room reacted before the judge could. A laugh broke from the press row. Someone whispered, the janitor has evidence now. Another voice murmured, only in Boston. Judge Harlan's expression tightened. Sir, identify yourself and return to your assigned area. Daniel nodded once, respectfully. My name is Daniel Mercer. I work maintenance in this building. Grant leaned back, almost smiling again. Then perhaps maintenance can wait until after federal proceedings. A few people chuckled, softer this time, waiting to see whether the judge would end the interruption. Daniel did not look at Grant. He kept his eyes on the bench, where authority belonged, and where truth still had a chance to be heard. I understand my position, Your Honor. I would not interrupt this court unless the record itself required it. Charlotte's breath caught, not loudly, but enough for Daniel to hear. There was something heartbreaking about hope when it first returns. It does not arrive like thunder. It comes like a match struck in a cold room, small, fragile, easy to dismiss until everyone realizes they were freezing. Judge Harlan studied him longer than she needed to. The lamps above the bench cast a clean white glow across her robe, across the brass seal, across the pages stacked before her. Mr. Mercer, this court is not open for commentary from spectators. No, Your Honor. Are you an attorney? The question hung there. Martin Vale turned his head sharply. Grant's fingers stopped moving around the silver pen. Daniel felt the old door inside him open another inch. He thought of Emily asking whether he would sit in the front row at her recital. He thought of Charlotte standing alone because powerful people had chosen comfort over courage. Then he reached into the worn wallet in his back pocket and removed a faded bar card, protected behind a plastic sleeve clouded by years of ordinary use. I was, he said, and by federal rule, I may still be heard for the limited purpose of preventing fraud upon this court. The laughter died so quickly it seemed to leave a mark in the air. The clerk took the card from the security officer, entered the number, and waited. Keys clicked. The screen loaded. Judge Harlan looked down. Her face changed, not dramatically, but completely. Daniel Robert Mercer, she read. Former federal trial attorney. Good standing. No disciplinary record. Martin Vale went pale. Charlotte turned toward Daniel fully now, her blue eyes wide with shock and something deeper than gratitude. Grant Ellison sat perfectly still, but his confidence had lost its shine. Daniel folded his hands in front of him, the way he once had before juries, and spoke with quiet dignity. Your Honor, I request permission to ask 3 questions before this court signs away an innocent woman's life. Judge Harlan did not answer immediately, and the pause that followed seemed to stretch from the bench to every corner of the room. The great seal above her chair caught the winter brightness, and for a moment the courtroom looked less like a place of punishment than a place of weighing, as if every word spoken there had been set on an invisible scale. Grant Ellison's lead attorney rose with a controlled smile. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Mercer has no formal appearance in this matter, no client authorization, and no standing to participate. Daniel turned slightly toward Charlotte. Miss Whitmore, do you consent to limited assistance for the purpose of addressing the authenticity of Exhibit 4? Charlotte stared at him, still absorbing the impossible truth that the quiet man in the gray uniform had once belonged to this world. Her voice came out soft, but clear. Yes, I consent. Martin Vale took one step forward. Charlotte, I strongly advise against that. She looked at him then, and the room felt the years between them collapse into one cold second. You no longer advise me, Martin. A hush moved through the benches, not like gossip this time, but like recognition. Judge Harlan folded her hands. Mr. Mercer, I will allow a narrow inquiry. 3 questions. No speech-making. No theatrics. If this becomes disorderly, I will end it. Daniel bowed his head. Understood, Your Honor. He walked to the evidence cart with measured care. Without the mop, without the bucket, without the familiar tools of his present life, he did not look taller, yet somehow the room made space for him. The clerk handed him a copy of the wire authorization. Daniel held it by the edges, respectful of the paper, but not afraid of what it claimed. Mr. Ellison, he said, turning toward Grant, you submitted this form as a true authorization from Miss Whitmore, correct? Grant sat forward, smooth again. That is correct. And you personally verified the internal access logs attached to it. Our compliance department did. That was not my question. The air tightened. Grant's attorney began to rise, but Judge Harlan lifted 2 fingers. Daniel waited, patient as a locked door. Grant's jaw shifted. Yes, I reviewed them. Daniel nodded once. First question. Why does the approval record show 3 separate system entries completed within 4 seconds across platforms that require independent 2-factor confirmation? A few reporters stopped writing. One of Grant's lawyers looked down at the binder. Grant smiled faintly. Automated synchronization. Daniel looked at the page again. Whitmore Biologics disabled automated synchronization for restricted research accounts after the Midwest audit last year, did it not? Charlotte's eyes widened. Grant said nothing for half a beat too long. Daniel continued, calm and exact. Second question. Who had administrator access to reactivate synchronization for account class R7 without triggering board notification? Grant adjusted his pen, but his fingers were no longer relaxed. Information technology would know that. Information technology reports to the finance office for payment authorization, does it not? Judge Harlan leaned forward. Martinvale's face had gone blank, the way guilty men look when memory becomes dangerous. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The truth was already standing up by itself. Daniel let the second question rest in the room until even the ventilation seemed to lower its voice. Grant Ellison looked toward his attorneys, but none of them offered him a place to hide. The beautiful courtroom, with its carved oak railings, high-arched windows, and pale winter light falling across the American flag, had changed its nature in less than 5 minutes. It no longer felt like a stage prepared for Charlotte Whitmore's downfall. It felt like a chapel where truth had quietly entered and taken a seat. Charlotte stood at the defense table with both hands folded before her, her fair face still marked by strain, but her posture now carried a different strength. Hope had not made her softer. It had made her steadier. Judge Harlan glanced from Daniel to Grant. Mr. Ellison, answer the question. Grant cleared his throat. The finance office oversees payment approval, not technical administration. Daniel nodded, almost gently. Then you agree that access changes would require a separate authorization trail. Generally, yes. And if there is no such trail? Grant's mouth tightened. Then the system would need to be reviewed. Thank you. Daniel turned back to the exhibit. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. A man who understands grace does not cheer when a liar begins to fall. He only steps aside and lets the floor become visible. Martinvale shifted again near the aisle, and Daniel saw it, the small movement of a man measuring the distance to the exit. Third question, Daniel said. Why did Miss Whitmore's former counsel decline to call St. Abigail's Children's Clinic, when its security records could confirm her location at the exact hour this transfer was supposedly approved? Martin froze. Charlotte slowly turned toward him. The question was no longer aimed at Grant alone, and everyone knew it. Judge Harlan's eyes narrowed. Mr. Vale, remain where you are. Martin raised both palms slightly, trying to appear offended rather than afraid. Your Honor, I withdrew because of an ethical conflict. Any strategic decisions before withdrawal remain privileged. Daniel looked at Charlotte. Do you waive privilege regarding counsel's refusal to obtain your alibi evidence for Exhibit 4? Her voice was quiet, but it crossed the room cleanly. Yes, I waive it. Martin swallowed. The reporters began writing again, not quickly this time, but carefully, as if the story had become too serious for careless ink. Daniel took one step toward the clerk. Your Honor, I request that the court direct the clerk to contact St. Abigail's Children's Clinic Records Office. The hospital maintains digital visitor logs, badge entries, hallway camera time marks, and charitable event registration. Miss Whitmore stated she was there after midnight. If that is true, then Exhibit 4 places her in 2 locations at once. Grant interrupted. This is speculation. Daniel turned to him at last. No, Mr. Ellison. Speculation is asking a court to destroy a woman's life with a document that moves faster than the system that supposedly created it. The room went utterly still. Judge Harlan looked to the clerk. Make the call. Charlotte closed her eyes for one brief second, not in defeat, but in relief. Daniel glanced at the clock. Emily's recital was getting closer. Yet for the first time that morning, he believed he might still make it there with his promise intact and his conscience unbroken. The clerk made the call from the side desk, and the entire courtroom seemed to breathe through that one telephone line. No one moved except the second hand on the brass clock above the rear doors, circling with patient authority, measuring the difference between accusation and proof. Sunlight had shifted across the polished floor, laying a bright path between Charlotte Whitmore and Daniel Mercer, as if the room itself had drawn a line from abandonment to rescue. The city outside continued without knowing what was happening inside. Horns faint beyond the glass, footsteps passing on the courthouse steps, a delivery driver rolling packages past granite columns. Ordinary America, moving while one extraordinary lie began to unravel. Charlotte stood very still, her blue eyes fixed on the clerk, her fair face luminous under the clean light, not because fear had left her, but because truth had finally found a way to enter the room. Grant Ellison stared at the exhibit binder. Martin Vale kept his briefcase close to his leg. Judge Harlan waited with the discipline of someone who understood that justice sometimes arrives not with a speech, but with a record pulled from a database. Yes, the clerk said into the phone. This is the United States District Court. We need visitor confirmation for St. Abigail's Children's Clinic, charitable wing opening, Thursday morning, 12:01 through 3:00. A pause followed. Papers rustled at the government table. A reporter lowered her pen as if writing too soon might disturb the answer. Daniel clasped his hands behind his back, the old stance returning to him without permission. Charlotte looked toward him. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. Daniel did not turn away from the bench. "Because nobody should stand alone against a lie." The clerk's expression changed. "Thank you. Please send the certified log to the court email immediately." Judge Harlan looked over. "What did they confirm?" The clerk stood. Miss Whitmore checked into the clinic at 11:24 at night and exited at 2:41 in the morning. Her badge was used at the neonatal wing, the donor hall, and the east elevator. Hospital security confirms continuous presence. A sound passed through the gallery. Not laughter, not shock, but the collective release of people realizing they had almost believed something cruel. Charlotte pressed one hand to the edge of the table. Grant's attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor, location alone does not disprove remote authorization." Daniel nodded. "Correct. Which is why the third question mattered." He lifted the access log page. The authorization was not merely remote. It was created through an internal administrator credential ending in 942. That credential pattern is familiar to me. Judge Harlan's gaze sharpened. "Explain." Daniel took one slow breath. 10 years ago, I prosecuted a medical finance laundering case involving fabricated approvals, duplicated metadata, and synchronized timestamps. The access architecture used in that case carried the same 942 administrator suffix. It was not random. It was a signature. Grant's chair creaked softly. Martin Vale closed his eyes for the length of a heartbeat. Daniel turned the page. That case also involved an outside compliance consultant who later became private counsel to companies under investigation. The room followed his eyes to Martin. Charlotte's voice was barely above a whisper. "Martin." Judge Harlan's tone became iron wrapped in velvet. "Mr. Vale, you will surrender all related communications to the court under seal pending review. Mr. Ellison, you will remain available for questioning by federal authorities. The emergency motion is denied without prejudice, and the court orders immediate preservation of all finance, legal, and board communications." Grant began to speak, but no clean sentence came. Martin lowered his head. Charlotte looked at Daniel as if the world had shifted back beneath her feet. Daniel only checked the clock because Emily would be waiting, and Grace, when it is real, still remembers the promises made before dawn. For several seconds after Judge Harlan spoke, nobody seemed willing to disturb the room by breathing too loudly. The motion that had nearly taken Charlotte Whitmore's company, name, and future had dissolved under the weight of 3 quiet questions. Grant Ellison sat with his shoulders lowered, his expensive confidence reduced to paperwork waiting for investigators. Martin Vale stood near the aisle with his briefcase still in his hand, but it no longer made him look important. It made him look small. Judge Harlan removed her glasses and looked at Charlotte with a seriousness that carried both authority and apology. "Miss Whitmore, this court will not suspend your executive authority today. You are instructed to preserve records and cooperate fully. Based on what has been presented, this matter now concerns possible fraud upon the court." Charlotte nodded. But for once she did not speak like a chief executive. She spoke like a person who had almost been erased and had been handed back her own voice. "Thank you, Your Honor." Daniel had already stepped away from the rail. The old fire inside him settled, not gone, but returned to its proper place. He did not reach for praise. He did not look toward the reporters. He walked back to the rear of the courtroom, picked up the mop handle, and checked the clock above the doors. 5:17. If the subway ran on time, and he caught the red line without delay, he could still reach Emily's school before the first song ended. Charlotte followed him into the hallway before he reached the service corridor. The corridor was beautiful in a quiet, forgotten way, with stone floors reflecting amber wall lamps and tall windows holding the last blue light of the Boston afternoon. Outside, the city had softened under early evening, office lights blooming one by one across the skyline, snow beginning to drift like torn paper over the courthouse steps. "Mr. Mercer," Charlotte said. Daniel stopped. She stood a few feet away, elegant and shaken, her blue eyes brighter now, her fair face no longer guarded by pride alone. "You saved everything I built." Daniel shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. The truth did that. I just pointed at it." She looked at his gray uniform, his worn shoes, the faded badge, and then at the bar card still tucked carefully in his wallet. "Why did you leave the law?" He glanced toward the street, where a bus sighed at the curb, and people hurried home carrying coffee, flowers, and ordinary troubles. "My daughter needed a father more than the courtroom needed another lawyer." Charlotte's expression changed then, as if those words reached a place no balance sheet ever could. "Then let me give you a ride." Daniel almost refused. Pride rose first, habit second, but grace sometimes arrives in the form of accepting help without surrendering dignity. He nodded. 20 minutes later, a black sedan stopped outside a brick elementary school in Quincy. Daniel slipped through the auditorium doors just as Emily Mercer stepped onto the small stage in a blue dress and white cardigan, her hands trembling above the borrowed keyboard. She saw him, and her whole face opened like mourning. Charlotte stood quietly in the back, unnoticed by most, watching the janitor's single dad take a seat in the front row with the peace of a man who had kept both promises. Emily played America the Beautiful with 2 missed notes and a brave little smile. Daniel clapped first. Then the room joined him. Weeks later, federal investigators would uncover the hidden emails, the altered access trails, and the private agreement that tied Grant and Martin together. Charlotte would rebuild her company with stricter safeguards and a humbler heart. Daniel would not return to full-time law, but once a month, he would volunteer at a legal clinic for parents who could not afford help. And on the wall of Charlotte's new neonatal wing, beneath a small bronze plaque, there would be no statue, no grand speech, no photograph of power. Only 7 words Daniel reluctantly allowed her to engrave. "Dignity needs no title to defend truth." That was how the story ended, not with revenge, not with noise, but with a father walking his daughter home beneath soft streetlights while a billionaire stood behind a hospital window and finally understood that respect is not bought by wealth, commanded by status, or preserved by fear. It is revealed in the moment someone with nothing to gain chooses to stand up for someone with everything to lose.